I had heard many stories and rumors that there was a secret hidden story behind the Willy Wonka story, but I had never really believed them. I thought of them as nothing more as mere jokes and or fan fiction. You know how people like to take things that are normally thought to be happy and whimsical, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and label Wonka as a pedophile or some shit like that? I never took anything like that seriously, and I just thought them to be things people with active, albeit minds have come up with. To me, the Wonka story was nothing more than a happy and innocent story made for children to enjoy. At least that's what I thought until the day I decided that I would actually find a way out for myself. I decided to mail someone who was once acquainted with Doll, and I was told not to give anything away about this person, by the way, just to see if any of this was true. Considering nearly everyone had something to say about this story, obviously having some sort of subtext about it, I thought that I would check just to be sure. I was told in the mail, and I quote, "You seem interested in this subject. Many people prefer to speculate, but you are the first one who seemed genuinely curious. Seeing as you want to know as much as you do, I will send you a tape in the mail. Check it within a week." It was a couple days or so later when the tape finally arrived. It had the words, "The True Story of Willy Wonka" written on it in black marker. The only other words on it were a copyright dated 1963, a year before the book had come out. At first, I thought this was strange, considering VHS tapes were not around back then. Then it occurred to me that it was possible it had been on film and then put on tape later. So I stuck the tape in and played it, after rewinding it to make sure. It started out a bit odd. For one thing, it immediately went to the title, taken directly from the first edition book cover, with no fade. It just sort of popped in, causing me to jump. What also made me jump was what came after that. The delayed, yet abrupt appearance of the music, which was loud and sounded like some fast, angry jazz music. Anyway, it went on to the credits and showed names I had never seen before. The only names I was able to recognize were Doll's Patricia Neals and some guy named John Black. It kept looping back to the name of the animation checker about 15 times. I generally thought that there was something wrong with the tape. Right as I went to take it out, it popped immediately in to the outside of the House of the Buckets, with the camera zooming in. The art style was really weird. It was black and white and had an odd, misty look about it, cross-hatched. There was a deep male voice that seemed most likely to be the narrator, but his voice was in horrible quality. It was muffled and at such a low volume that I could barely make out a word he was saying. It cut inside the Bucket's house, and the misty, cloudy look was even weirder here. The people moved all wavery-like and wouldn't stop moving, much like those old Zelda CDI games. But the shading was cross-hatched, which meant there would be a lot of extra movement. Sometimes it was hard to make out what was going on. The characters behaved oddly. It seemed Charlie was either gay or highly effeminate, as he spoke with a girly voice and spoke of his love for dolls and princesses. And it seemed that everyone feared Grandpa Joe. We find out later that he was involved in World War I, and though it is never explained how, it is clear he was responsible for ending it. Charlie's parents also displayed odd behavior. The dad seemed depressed, and the mom seemed paranoid, and suffered from some major form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. The other grandparents never spoke at all. From here on out, it is not too different from the book, except for the characters and the fact that Charlie sings songs about his dress he wishes to wear. The story about Wonka is also slightly different. Apparently, he is a Grinch and happened to appear out of nowhere, suddenly owning an impressive factory that no one saw built. It seems here no one worked in his factory, nor did it have any problems causing it to shut down. But when Charlie finds the ticket, it happens halfway through the finding. Also, we don't see any of the other kids giving their interviews as they win. And the message on the ticket found in the book, or in any other film adaptation, is absent. In fact, the ticket is blank. No mention of it being gold, but it's black and white, so it's hard to tell anyways. So anyway, the big day came and everyone is waiting at the gate. It is very similar to the book version, except there are 6 kids, and Charlie is wearing his dress, and the lines spoken by the people are slightly changed from the book halfway through. There are talks about Wonka being a Grinch, how his factory got there, and how it got made. And there is a story about Prince Pondicherry's death, having died drowning in Wonka's chocolate palace. They talk about more stuff, but then the wind picks up, drowning them out. Though nothing is ever seen blowing, there's just a sound effect of a howling wind. Then there are bells that chime for when it's time for the gates to open, just like in the book. Surprisingly, I can hear it over the loud howling wind, but it hits me that the chimes are not church bells like the book describes. They're funeral bells. That's very weird, but this is not the weirdest part. The weirdest part is Wonka himself. When the doors swing open, you can see a dark, shadowy figure stand at the doorway, and then Wonka comes out of the factory hopping and prancing. He certainly does not appear human, though it is somewhat hard to tell due to the style of cross-hatching and the lack of color. Again, this isn't even the weirdest part. The weirdest part is his eyes. He had a reptilian stare that quite literally sent chills down my spine. His hair kept moving, not because of the constant motion and cross-hatching. It just moved like he was underwater. The wind was even louder here now as he pranced and hopped down towards the gate. Once he arrived, he spoke. Strangely, I could hear his voice loud and clear, even though the cheering and talking from the audience was barely audible. His voice was high, like explained in the book, but not the kind of high voice I expected. He sounded like Michael Jackson speaking seductively. As normal, the kids had to show him their tickets, which he stuck down his pants, and they walked inside. It wasn't too different from the book here on out, except for when they started down the hallways, which looked like a demented Tim Burton-style artwork. They kept getting more narrow and kept sloping down more and more the further they went. They also seemed to twist more as they entered each new hallway. The weirdest part is that there's no dialogue here except for a line from Veruca about needing to use the loo, which her father tells her that probably won't happen until the end of the tour. There is also a slow rising of the howling winds from earlier. I found it strange that such a thing would appear inside the factory. They entered an even more twisted and looping-looking hallway with funeral bells chiming once again. The odd thing is the art style, once they entered this room, had changed completely. While still remaining cross-hatched and wavery animated, it fully looked like something Tim Burton might draw. The narrator from earlier had also returned. but he was somewhat clearer. I could tell that the same voice clip from earlier, as I recognized a few of the same inflections. Oddly, he didn't seem to have been talking about the buckets like I would have expected for the intro. I still found him hard to make out, but I managed to catch a few words such as Grinch, Wonka, and then something about the Oompa Loompas. At this point, I had goosebumps. I actually did not want to know what he was trying to say here, but I was still very curious. And then everything got interrupted by a long message found on a black screen with white text. The writing was in a different language. It looked like an odd mixture between Greek and Korean, and somehow managed to look like Blackletter ITC font. There was no sound here at all. Everything was in total silence, though the howling winds show up abruptly a couple minutes in. I expected it to return to the movie here, but it went on a few more minutes before it actually returned back to the movie. They continued to walk through the twisted halls, this one looking particularly messy, with the shadowy figures of Wonka and the gang walking through. It changed to a side view, and everyone was still black and shadowy, and Wonka was still hopping down in an abrupt change as the funeral bell sounded again. Then he was walking slowly. The way he was walking reminded me very much of The Undertaker from WWF, specifically in his Ministry of Darkness days. Other than the obvious, what was also freaky about it is the fact that it happened abruptly with no transitional frames. There was, again, no dialogue aside from one of the kids, I assume a girl, saying, "I don't like this, Daddy." Suddenly, they walked through into the chocolate room. No door or entrance. They just walk in. All sound is gone, and each one that actually shows up is distant and echoey. And when they get here, it starts to get really strange. The room looks eerily identical to the one in 2005, and it is not cross-hatched, but in what looks like a black and white painting style. The chocolate river. This was one of the more unsettling moments because the river looks like real blood, the only colored element in the film. Not blood done in realistic style, but though somebody actually dipped a brush into a cup of blood and ran the brush across those parts. What it made it even more unsettling is the textures that would slightly change with each frame. Quite unsettling, because how were they able to get so much blood to make up each possibly 700,000 or more pieces of paper? But that isn't the weirdest part. It gets worse. The room doesn't seem to function like normal, as Wonka is not introducing anyone to the room, nor showing them around. He suddenly starts speaking about the Oompa Loompas, a group of black pygmies that he had smuggled from Africa. Illegally, he adds. They are then shown, but the unsettling part is the fact that, unlike in the book, they were happy and cheerful and always singing and laughing, but here, they look miserable. And each time they look at Wonka, they look terrified. And they give him a look that basically says, "Please don't kill me." Actually, I thought I might have heard one say that, but I couldn't quite tell if he said kill, as he was far away and sobbing. It actually had more of the sound of ack, rather than kill. The camera from this point stayed at a bird's eye view. Wonka then yelled angrily at the Oompa Loompas with a ridiculously loud voice. It was loud, high-pitched, and screechy. I couldn't even understand him. He could have been speaking in another language, for all I know. Then he turned back to his guests and said something about them that sounded so shockingly and despicably racist. But then it continued to get worse. By the end, what he had ended up saying about them was just so plain abysmal that, and slightly terrifying that I won't even repeat it. It was so bad that even a white supremacist would be offended by it. Now, I'm not that super sensitive or politically correct type who thinks that blacks can do no wrong, not racist either, but even I was distraught about what he said. The Salts were revealed to be racists, not surprisingly, but even they were offended. Anyway, the Viking boat arrived, but it had some odd reptilian designs about it. The gang got in, and I heard Veruca say, "Daddy, I want lots of things, but I do not want a dreadful boat like this." But that's all I could hear. The gang did talk, but their voices were drowned out by a group of crying Oompa Loompas and the overly loud sailing of the boat in the chocolate blood river. They ended up going through a dark tunnel, and it was very close to the 1971 film with Gene Wilder. You know, that psychedelic tunnel ride? But I could barely make out what any of them were saying, as the style was made more convoluted. Veruca commented about her underpants being drenched in pee. The sixth child, who was another girl and spoke some of Violet's lines in the film, "What is this, a freak out?" I was absolutely baffled about who this was, though. I also noticed Augustus Gloop was gone, though I assumed he fell into the chocolate river. Anyway, Wonka sang his rowing song, like in the 1971 film, though he sang it closer to how Marilyn Manson sang it, with extra vibrato. The fast, angry jazz music from the intro shows up once again. It seems odd and out of place. I kept seeing the names JB pop up in the background. John Black? And then the images became clear. The background images show Oompa Loompas crying, and some are singing something in some kind of African language. Then Wonka's song starts turning into some kind of bizarre language. It sounded like some kind of Yiddish chant, until halfway through it starts to have a slight hint of German in it. His eyes get bigger, his mouth grows larger, and his teeth have a sudden change to being sharp and snake-like. Then it pauses right on his face for a few minutes, and the funeral bells return. The narrator from the beginning shows up again, but halfway through rather than starting out from the beginning. His voice is now very clear. He mentions the Oompa Loompas being illegally smuggled from a deep, dark forest in Africa, and what peaceful lives they lived. But there was a shocking mention of horrid things Mr. Wonka did to smuggle them. Again, I will not repeat them. He is about to speak about what happened to them and how the factory got there, but it immediately skips into a room where I can barely make out anything that's going on. No one said anything about it. Well, had no one said anything about it, I would never guessed it was the inventing room. From here on out, it just keeps skipping to different rooms, a child disappearing each time. Here, however, it seems no one knows how they disappear. The sixth child, I still don't know who she is, but I think I heard someone refer to her as Miranda, unless that was the name of one of the parents, who are mostly unnamed in the book. But I am pretty sure they were referring to this mysterious sixth character. At least she spoke when the name was said, but the funeral bells were so high and loud here, it was hard to hear if she even responded to them. Anyway, The last room they appear in features Wonka making sick powder. The sixth girl does not seem very pleased about it. Wonka gets extremely angry about this and shouts angrily right in her face. Once again, loud, screechy, and unintelligible. The fact that it was not distant made it even worse. It sounded so loud it echoed through the room. Then the girl runs inside the door to where it's being made. And then it cuts to Wonka's face, slowly zooming in closer and closer. He has a huge, rapish grin about him. Very spooky, but I hated to keep looking, but I had to see what was about to come, so I reluctantly did so. Some weird noises that resemble one of those creepy background sounds you hear on something like the History Channel. Maybe you know what I'm talking about, or heard, but they are kind of muted and muffled sounding. Wonka's face, once it zooms closer, starts to show some disturbing texture about it that looks kind of reptilian. It appears his eyes are slowly getting wider. His pupils morph into slits, and his teeth, once again, become sharp and snake-like. Then everything goes silent as the black screen with white text appears once again, looking, as last time, half Greek and half Korean. Then Wonka begins to chant something that sounded like Yiddish. It has a clearly different chant than last time. Then it showed hints of German in it, a bit more than last time. Then the text then flickered to an English translation, but it happened way too fast. Too fast for me to even stop and read it. And then it went back to where it was, and it was a still picture of the group standing around the room with nothing but funeral bells being heard. It lasted for a few minutes, then it started to go in motion again once the funeral bells sounded. Then I heard someone shout, "Miranda!" So this is her name. Anyway, these two ran off into the room as Wonka stared down at Charlie. Honestly, I had practically forgotten he was even here, because he was barely shown throughout the whole thing. In fact, Veruca and this mysterious Miranda girl were shown the most. I felt as if Mike and Violet were not even in this, considering their names were never even spoken. I also forgotten that he was in a dress. I probably thought he was Violet or Veruca or something. I heard him speak again and remembered that he was gay or either highly effeminate. Wonka went on telling him that he won, but instead of taking him directly to the great glass elevator like in both of the movies or whatever, he told him to wait a minute. He then hopped off into another room. He found every one of the other kids in here except for Miranda. He said something that I did not quite understand. It was English, but had a rather convoluted meaning. The children lying down on the floor could be heard crying and moaning, similar to the Oompa Loompas. The parents could not be seen anywhere. He then turned on the radio and slowly began to strip. The one thing that gave me goosebumps was that what was playing on the radio. It reminded me a lot like one of those songs you would hear in an old Mario game when you fight Bowser, despite it being in a typical style that you would hear during the early 60s, such as the Beatles and the Monkees, but it was one singer only. It also sounded like though the keyboardist did not know exactly how to play it right. But that wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part is this. Now it sounded disordered like an old radio, like it was from the 60s, and it was more in the background, so it was a little hard to hear. And also because it wasn't super loud. Anyway, I couldn't pick out the exact lyrics, but I did hear him mention some freaky shit That would happen to a bunch of different people by the year 2014. It was like a bunch of random names being spurted out, but he obviously seemed to know who they were. And what was going to have happened to them is too horrible to even mention. I don't even remember half of them. It took me a second to sink back into the movie as my mind drifted away, absolutely stunned by the music. But when I did, I saw Wonka take off his shirt and throw it off and finally slowly drop to the ground. After that, the credits rolled. All sound was gone from here. Appearing again were the odd names from the intro. I kept rolling to see if anything came on after this, only to find a message placed at the end that seemed to have been put in later, as the look, quality, and style of it had an early 90s feel to it. It read, "Don't let Felicity know." Then the tape stopped. I did not know who Felicity was until I looked it up and found out it was the name of Roald Dahl's second wife. As you may guess, I was quite shocked about what I had just seen, but also relatively confused about what any of this even was. I went and asked the person about this who had sent me this tape, who told me, obviously, this is how Roald Dahl had originally written the book. He always made films of these books before he wrote them, so he could keep track of every idea he had, and also check and see if any of the lines these characters spoke worked outside of just being read. What happened from there and how it ended up the way it was, I really do not know. I didn't know Roald Dahl long enough, but I started to question the man after I got a hold of this tape. I then asked this person if he wanted the tape back, but they refused and seemed glad enough to get rid of it. Though they did not want this tape to be gone forever, they still wanted proof and information to stick around. Ever since I saw this tape, I have been looking around to see if I could get any information on it anywhere, and so far, I cannot seem to find anything.